Welcome to the Global Philosophy of Religion project at the University of Birmingham, run by Professor Yujin Nagasawa. We at Closer to Truth are pleased to participate. Victoria Harrison, an old friend of Closer to Truth, is Professor of Philosophy and Associate Dean of Arts and Humanities at the University of Macau. Victoria, it is great to see you again.
Thank you, Robert. It's delightful to see you again too, and to be part of this really exciting project on global philosophy of religion.
Let's get into it by talking about what some people call a crisis in philosophy of religion. Is philosophy of religion relevant in today's increasingly multicultural world?
Yes, that's a very good place to start. I think it's over the last 20 years or so that one hears about this supposed crisis in philosophy of religion. And the basic complaint seems to be that philosophers of religion have come to focus on a very narrow range of questions. And on top of that, their work has become increasingly analytic as they try to become more integrated into the academic scene in the UK, especially Europe and the US, which means that their work is increasingly inaccessible to people not trained in this kind of analytic tradition. And that, well, this is the complaint. So I myself find it rather misplaced, because what I perceive in the current field is actually a great regeneration. And this is especially evident, I think, in the last decade or so. We now have philosophers of religion working in a much broader spectrum of topics than was previously the case. The criticism that philosophy of religion has become too analytic is really more of a caricature. And there's much more to the subject than narrow analysis. Having said that, though, I should add that it isn't my view that the narrow analysis is a bad thing. I think it's a very positive development, but it has to be seen as part of the discipline rather than the whole.
You've talked about a new style of philosophy of religion as framed by the concept of religion, whereas the old style, or the analytic style of religion, is framed by the concept God, in that the questions that were asked in the Western analytic tradition were very specific questions about the existence of God, the traits of God, contradictions, problem of evil, those kinds of issues.
Yes, I think this is the great revolution which is currently happening within philosophy of religion. As you said, formerly, God was the central concept within the discipline, which meant that all of the questions philosophers of religion considered were derivative upon that concept. And moreover, it was a concept understood in a fairly restricted way. The God of classical or omnitheism, we might say. So the revolution is, if you try to reorganize the discipline around the concept of religion, all of a sudden you open up whole new domains of inquiry. Nothing is lost from the old set of questions and topics, but they're seen as part of a more comprehensive whole.
Do you differentiate between philosophy of religion and the term philosophical theology? Because the latter, philosophical theology, is applying philosophical techniques to issues about God, the interactions between the various omnis, omnipotent, omniscience, omnipotence, all good, those kinds of issues, which are part of a philosophical theology tradition, which is a subset I think, of philosophy of religion.
Yes, I agree with you. I would say that philosophical theology is a subset of philosophy of religion, although it is it has a special status, I would say, because the philosophy is performed um, on the objects, and the objects are the objects of faith. I'm not sure if I've expressed that as well as I could have. So let me just try again with that formulation, if you don't mind. Um, Philosophical theology is philosophy that's done within the accepted parameters of a faith, whereas philosophy of religion doesn't have the same faith imposed parameters to its inquiry. And I would also, of course, distinguish between philosophical theology and the philosophy of theology. And the philosophy of theology is philosophy as applied to theology as a discipline. So it looks at the norms and practices of theology. And in the same way that philosophy of mathematics would look at the norms and practices of mathematics.
Right. So that's a significant difference, even though these words are kind of interchangeable. Philosophy of theology looks at theology as a discipline, like of science or mathematics or language, whereas philosophical theology takes the specific objects. Classic one in Christianity is the Trinity, how to make sense out of a triune God that is monotheism. I'm not going to get into that, but that's an issue of philosophical theology.
Yes, that's right. So they're very different enterprises, um, no less valuable, but I think it's helpful to recognize that they are distinct, that they can each have a place in our general intellectual inquiry.
I'm all for the expansion of philosophy of religion in a multicultural sense and in a multi-conceptual sense, but I am a little concerned that by, I don't want to say downgrading, but kind of making analytic philosophy of religion less central, we may lose some of the rigor that religion may try to squirm out of, pardon the expression. So I really want to make a case for the way of thinking of analytic theology to pervade much of what we do in philosophy of religion, even as that gets broader.
Yes, and actually, I would not disagree with you. Um, I think that the problem with analytic philosophy, insofar as it's been done in the past several decades, is that it's been focused on a very narrow range of issues. And this is what's tended to make its results less obviously relevant to people who are outside the field. But analytic philosophy itself is, as you know, a very, very powerful tool. And it's one that can be used on a much broader spectrum of beliefs. And it's actually already quite at home, especially within classical Hindu and Buddhist philosophies.
The issue of philosophy of religion is the approach of philosophical ways of thinking to a discipline, in this case, religion. But here's the question. Religion is a different kind of discipline than I would say virtually anything else, because religion embeds a belief or a belief system in some higher transcendent reality. And so for a philosopher to look at religion from a strictly philosophical point of view, but yet having or not having an association with that belief system as a real belief, I think presents challenges to philosophy of religion that exist nowhere else in philosophy. So much so that some have claimed that a dispassionate view from inside a tradition is not even possible And therefore, philosophy of religion is legitimate, but only if tradition specific. How do you address that bundle of ideas?
Yeah, so it's a very large bundle. So let me try. Um, yes, yeah, there are people who argue that philosophy of religion can only be tradition specific. And from my perspective, I think that this is just unnecessarily limiting. There is a lot of value to tradition specific work. And I think that it can make a very important contribution to philosophy of religion as a whole. But I don't agree with the philosophical objection, which states that that's the only kind of philosophy of religion that we can do. And part of the reason for that is that on a very abstract philosophical level, it's actually, well, relatively unproblematic to look very deeply into the religious philosophies of a number of religious traditions. The obstacles are largely practical in terms of access to historical sources and access to the languages in which the texts are written. But my view is, well, we're all human beings. Our intellects are, in fact, not that different, although our experiences may be. So, with enough study, technical expertise, and imagination, it's possible to engage quite deeply in traditions which you would not regard as your own.
In attempting to bridge this gap in philosophy of religion between East and West, you've brought up the potential role of fictionalism, assuming that the object, the religion, is neither true nor false. Not saying that it's total fiction, but truth or falsity of it is not an attribute that you worry about. So the question is, why would such an approach, fictionalism, potentially have this bridging role? And then why do you reject it ultimately?
I regard fictionalism as a hermeneutical device. And the function of this hermeneutical device is to allow the philosopher to enter as deeply as possible into the thought worlds, the philosophical religious system that otherwise might be inaccessible to them. So fictionalism has incredible power with this particular task. I've tried it myself in my struggle to come to understand Chinese, the philosophy of Chinese folk religion. So I found it very helpful in that enterprise. Fictionalism, as I understand it, doesn't deny that there are true and false claims. It merely brackets out questions about truth or falsity to allow for a hermeneutics of understanding to develop. And the reason for this is if you begin your philosophical inquiry with the assumption that the belief system you're looking at can't possibly be anywhere near the truth, then you're really not going to come to a very solid understanding. So, what's necessary is a bracketing off. I've borrowed this term from Husserl of questions about truth and falsity to facilitate deeper understanding. So that aspect of fictionalism I haven't rejected, and I'm still working on this. However, the claim which I have made in the past is that it's quite problematic if you want to use fictionalism to underwrite a theory of religious diversity. And the reason for that is that the fictionalist can study a range of belief systems, not all of which actually support religious diversity themselves. So you're not automatically going to get religious diversity or a theory of religious diversity out of fictionalism. It's two separate enterprises here.
And in that case, you're also dealing with, you're taking the fictionalism approach yourself, but the large majority of the religions that you study, each one of them, the veracity of it, in some cases, the unique veracity is its shining characteristic.
So I take fictionalism as a methodological standpoint. It's the standpoint of a scholar. So I have never recommended that actual religious believers or worshippers become fictionalists. I think that would be quite an implausible, implausible claim. No one would follow it. So fictionalism for me is at a different logical level. It's a methodological approach, which I have certainly found very useful, and also others.
So give me a rough summary of how philosophy of religion can become, as you put it, genuinely a multicultural discipline.
The most obvious thing to say is that the scope of the discipline has to be expanded. So we spoke about this earlier. It's the shift away from the concept of God as the central concept determining the questions to the concept of religion as the key concept from which all of the questions and topics follow. So that's the most basic point. But that by itself is not enough for several reasons. The first reason is that in expanding the scope, you're inevitably going to encounter religious traditions that have their own highly developed philosophies with their own philosophical methodologies. So this will require an expansion of the skills of philosophers with respect to different methodologies. So particularly thinking about the Indian, the classical Indian philosophical tradition and post-classical, there are styles of thinking which are similar to analytic philosophy, but have their own unique characteristics. These will have to be incorporated into the new discipline. And
yeah, let's get into some specifics now. I want to talk specifically about Eastern religions. Your focus has been on this, and now you're in Macau, so you're in a very multicultural area of the world in general. So I really look forward to exploring some specifics in Eastern philosophy. And when we talk about that, we're obviously talking about the main Buddhist and Hindu philosophical schools, as well as Jainism as one. And in Chinese philosophy, Confucianism and Taoism, which is the indigenous religion, Confucianism is big debate about is that a religion or a philosophy, but but all of this together. So I want to begin by asking, what are the approaches to God or deities in terms of the questions of arguments for God's existence or the deity's existence, or arguments against that? In Western tradition, this is a rich area of philosophy of religion. We luxuriate in the arguments for and against God's existence. I love to do that. How much of that is extant in these Eastern philosophies?
In order to talk about this, we've got to distinguish very carefully between a number of different traditions. But the big divide, obviously, is the one between the Semitic traditions and the traditions coming out of India, with, of course, Buddhism crossing this divide. So to take first the traditions of China, there was a very ancient tradition that recognized a supreme god, Tian, heaven. And this was a very important part of the ancient worldview of the Shang people. However, as as that tradition evolved, it became increasingly influenced by other cultural groups within the region we now know as China. And it adopted especially animist beliefs from the indigenous culture to the south. So as a result, by the time we come to the Common Era, the idea of the one supreme God has become less important. And you're not going to really find any arguments for the existence of that God. I think the best that can be done with the early material is to use a pragmatic argument. So it would go like this. In human societies, there is a supreme leader. This is the Chinese model. And others follow under this in hierarchical order that's very strict. So if this is the case in the human realm, then it's obviously going to be the case in the divine realm. So this is the pragmatic argument which will get you to a supreme God. However, it's worth saying that that supreme God is never really very active in human affairs. It's only the gods which are part of the hierarchy that are thought to have any engagement with human reality. And in the case of these gods, there is a very simple practical test of their powers and abilities. And that is whether or not they actually are effective. Do they do what you expect them to do? Do they make rain? Do they prevent floods? Do they heal the sick? If they don't, then they're demoted from their divine status. So this is a very different way of thinking about gods. And it's, I think, very interesting in its own right, but it has little in common with the kind of thinking about this we have in the West. For that, we have to look to India.
And the traditions that grew up in the Indian subcontinent, how do they address questions of God's existence or non-existence?
Again, it differs from philosophical school to philosophical school. I think the most rigorous defenses are going to come from the Nyaya school, who were theists, and they defended both a form of design argument and a kind of cosmological argument that have similarities to these arguments as they developed in later Western philosophy. But they also have some quite interesting differences. And this shows us that there was very definitely a real concern to present an argument for the existence of a God, the God in question here being named as Ishvara. The style of arguments that were developed over several centuries really focus on epistemological questions. So the question, how can we know that the argument forms we are developing to demonstrate the existence of this God are to be trusted? So it's really the process of reasoning by which we come to conclude that the God exists, which was the focus of attention there.
Yeah, that's very sophisticated. That would fit in very well in an analytic philosophy course that you might teach.
Yeah, absolutely. And the great critics of this, of course, were the Buddhist philosophers, who again engaged very closely in debate about this, focusing on the epistemological aspects of the questions.
Let's look at the same religious groups in Eastern philosophy, but now ask the question about assuming this God or gods do exist, what is their nature or traits? And I'd like you to do it in a sense, in a comparison with the traditional Judeo-Christian traits of God's perfection, the omni groups, omnipotence, omniscience, omnipresent, God's timelessness, worship worthiness, these kinds of adjectives that describe this perfect being theology that has emerged in classical Western traditions. How do the Eastern characterizations of God or the deities compare with that?
There is several ways to address this question. And I would like to start just by saying something briefly about the Western characterization of the omnigod. It seems to me that the omnigod idea is a result of the, so to say, the task that the god was expected to perform. So in Western philosophy, Western religion, what was required was the kind of God who would be able to create a world and create time. So people reasoned, well, what sort of qualities must this God have in order to be able to do that? And they eventually come up with the list of omni-qualities. Now, in India, the Nyaya were asking the same kind of question. So the list of qualities of God that they came up with were remarkably similar. Though I think they emphasized omniscience, as did most of the theistic Indian traditions, rather than omnipotence. The reason being that omnipotence has more to do with the God's ability to engage in causal processes, for which in the Western tradition has been much more important than it has in Eastern traditions, partly because causality is generally thought to be somehow a more superficial, at a more superficial level of reality.
In any of these traditions, I want to ask, is God ever considered as a person? The concept of God as a person with personhood features like awareness, intent, will. This is a controversial subject even in Western philosophy of religion, in that although the vast majority of people who believe in Judeo-Christian religions believe that God is a person in that sense. Some of classical theology in the Christian tradition has God in a non-personal sense, in a ground of being sense, as opposed to a person. Do these debates occur whether God is a person in the Eastern traditions?
They do to some extent, and very often they're debates within traditions. So, for example, within the tradition of Vedanta, the two of the major thinkers, Ramanuja and Shankara, disagree on precisely this issue. Is God personal or non-personal? From Shankara's perspective, what we're calling God here, he would have termed Brahman. And Brahman is characterized for him by three terms: consciousness and bliss, sort of, and being, Sat Chit Ananda, consciousness, being, and bliss. This is not personal. However, Shankara realize that in order for a human mind to relate to a being like this in worship, it was necessary to impose certain characteristics onto it. And these would be personal characteristics. So that's how you get a personal God. It's superimposed onto something which is non-personal.
It's interesting the parallels between what occurred in Indian philosophy and philosophy of religion with what occurred in the West, debating that fundamental question: is God a person? Obviously, we don't find that in Buddhism and some of the other religions, which don't have God in that sense at all. But when you're willing to have a theistic view, then that question, is God a person, is the fundamental one.
Yes, although in India it's even more complex, I think, than it is in the West, because there are different views of what a person actually is. I think nowadays, when we think about persons, we assume that persons are the possessors of consciousness. And this is one of their defining features. Whereas in the Indian traditions, persons are thought of in a number of different ways. And there's a very strong tradition of thought which identifies consciousness as non-personal. So to say that something is conscious doesn't imply that it actually is a person with a will and intention, and all of these other things that come in that package of ideas we associate with personhood.
I think this is one of the most fundamental distinctions of between East and West, and also one of the most fundamental questions you can pose to reality is the position of consciousness. And we see that from a scientific point of view, that it's just an accident of evolution, adaptation, and you see it in various Eastern religions where it's the fundamental reality that's non-personal. And in the Christian religion, consciousness is indeed a requirement of God as a person. So consciousness is absolutely a fundamental a probe, if you will, of the nature of the religious belief.
Yes, I certainly agree with that. And interestingly, it's one of the foci of attention that you also find in Chinese philosophy, especially in the Neo-Confucian schools, which have been in turn influenced by the forms of Buddhism that came to focus on consciousness and non-personal consciousness. So this seems to be a very fruitful area of future research within a global philosophy of religion.
I think that's great. I think consciousness is that kind of probe, and to assess the importance and relevance of consciousness in each of these different traditions is a whole other framework in which to do philosophy of religion on a global basis.
And it will change the range of views that we have available to consider about human persons, but also, and most especially, about the ultimate. However we want to name it.
Yeah, I like that you wrote that you want to reopen the question of what is God. To reopen the question, what is God? That's a big ambition, Victoria. So you compared the classical God of Anselm, which is wonderfully defined as that than which no greater can be conceived, with insights from Eastern traditions, particularly from Vedanta and the Hindu tradition, to develop what you call a philosophical account of the supreme nature as consciousness that you claim is can be consistent with both key elements in Western religious thought and Eastern thought, but which removes the central place of the omni-God. That's a big that's ambitious.
Yes, and I'm very happy that you brought that up. This is one of my main interests at the moment, has been for many years. That I think the great problem is with the term God, because as soon as you say God in a philosophical context or just an everyday context, what you get is almost a pre-packaged set of ideas that come into people's minds. And in Western contexts, these are generally the ideas associated with the omnigod. So, of course, everybody knows that God is omniscient, omnipotent, omnibenevolent. This is just taken for granted. But I think if we look more deeply into the tradition, the Western tradition, this is actually highly problematic. And if we go back to Anselm and look at his formulation, that than which no greater can be thought, the omnigod is thought to come out of this because people are assuming that than which no greater can be thought must be maximally omnipotent, maximally omniscient, maximally omnibenevolent. But there is never any defense, or at least never any that I've come across, to explain the leap from that than which nothing greater can be thought to this list of characteristics. The list of characteristics is derived from thinking about human persons and what makes them particularly great. And of course, power, knowledge, goodness. So these are extrapolated onto the concept of God. And maybe this is right, but it seems to me that it needs a serious reevaluation. And if we look back further into the Western tradition, what we find is an emphasis on other characteristics or other ways of characterizing deity, with an emphasis on singularity. So lack of distinction, in other words, and also aseity, having its being within itself, which another way of putting that is to say that it has ontological independence. It does not depend for its existence on anything else. So these are the characteristics which I would like the reinvestigation of the concept of God to focus on. And these are also the characteristics that give us an enormous amount of overlap with certain Indian traditions and also to some extent Chinese traditions. Because in the metaphysics of the ancient world, one of the really key questions was the distinction, or how to explain the distinction between beings which are dependent for their existence on others and beings or a being which is not. And it was generally understood that the being which is not dependent cannot have parts, because if it had parts, its existence would be dependent on its parts. So this is a whole new conception that's in so many traditions across the world, that I think it's a great place to start an investigation in global philosophy of religion.
Would you conclude from this, particularly in the Eastern traditions, that all religions in one way or another are envisioning or worshiping the same entity, the same being, whether you call it God or obviously everyone has different name in their language? Does this search for a common source, is that useful, or is that a distortion? Because each it's the tension between a universalism and a particularism. How do the Eastern traditions? I know the controversy in the West over this, But what about the Eastern traditions about their view of other religions, and is everybody addressing the same being source?
I think how we approach this question depends on what level of abstraction or generality we want to focus on. If we look just at the underlying metaphysical structures of beliefs at their most basic, what we find is that people are asking very similar questions, questions about ontological independence, and also questions about causation. These are very fundamental things. And what comes out of this is what I've sometimes called a bare theological object, something which has, well, probably no characteristics, but yet can be characterized. At least we can talk about it using the kind of formula that Anselm or even Shankara came up with. So we can talk about that at the level of philosophical commonality. However, I don't think that this implies that all religions are worshipping the same entity. And it's partly because, as all of the philosophers I've mentioned realized, this object is not actually a viable object of worship. It cannot be engaged with in the human world. The best we can do is have intellectual access to it. So in order to provide for a religious life which has any richness and any engagement and any ability to sustain human beings through the difficulties they encounter, you have to extrapolate from this idea. And when you do that, you end up with very different religious conceptions that are culturally and historically inflected. And these tend to be the objects of worship. These one can engage with on a day-to-day basis, but they're not the philosophical ultimate.
At the University of Birmingham, of course, John Hick, a great philosopher who we were happy to feature on Closer to Truth some years ago, talks about the real as this kind of common denominator of all religions. We'd say in mathematics, the lowest common denominator, but he would mean the highest common denominator in that sense. But the criticism of that, of course, is when you do that, you wind up with nothing.
Yes. I actually think that Hick's view is really indebted already to Shankara's Vedanta. It's pretty much the same position, but just in a modern guise. And Shankara was a very active religious figure in his own day, and he realized this problem, which is why he went to some lengths to try to explain how Brahman, as it is perceived and engaged with within the reality of our world, is connected to the Brahman without qualities that we cannot engage with. And ultimately, what he said is that there's a relationship of dependence between the two. Obviously, it can't be causal dependence because Brahman without qualities is not engaged in causal or physical causal relations. So it's something else is going on there. But everybody realizes who thinks in this kind of way that there has to be some connection between the metaphysical description of the ultimate and what people actually do in their religious lives. But this was Hick's great problem. And I think it is a problem for everyone.
Victoria, we don't have very much time, but I must get to a subject that you've talked about that I really love. It's a little off center from what we've talked about, but to me, very fundamental. And it's the relationship between mathematics and the object of theology. You argue that theology is not amenable to the empirical approach or the scientific method, which I think is patently obvious. So you use the parallelism between mathematical realism and what you call theological realism. How does that work, and what are those parallels?
I think that this is not such a great divergence of topic as you might suspect. um, the reason that I was interested in philosophy of mathematics was because there's been a lot of debate there about the characterization of abstract mathematical objects, and also about the question, how can we know them? So in general, abstract mathematical objects are characterized as lacking spatiotemporal coordinates. So they're not at any particular place in time or space. They don't enter into our sensory experience, and they are acausal. At least they're not involved in physical causal chains. All of these points follow. So if something is non-spatiotemporal, then it can't be involved in physical causal chains, therefore it can't enter into our experience. My thinking about this went, well, isn't the theological object, the bare theological object, rather similar to this? In the God of theology, or at least the God of philosophical theology, is one that doesn't enter into our sensory experience. And it's not regarded to have a particular location in space or time. It may be omnipresent or eternal, but it doesn't have a particular location. And it's plausible to hold that it doesn't enter into physical causal chains. So can we use the arguments of philosophy of mathematics in order to give an account of this bare theological object? So this is what I have attempted to do. And this is where the project converges with what we've been talking about, because that bare theological object turns out to be precisely the requirements that might fill out Anselm's formula, that than which no greater can be conceived. And if we have that formula and the bare theological object, then it makes sense that we're going to be able to explain the great diversity of theological views of God in different religious traditions. They're elaborations of this empty concept, which is more like a limit of thought. We can't go any deeper if we want to think about the ultimate. But this is the thing from which other more concrete religious views are extrapolations.
I think it's a fascinating methodology and probe of how we consider theological concepts of God in this bare sense, as you've said. I think the problem, though, if you don't mind, is that it makes this bare theological object, which many call God, inert. And with mathematical objects, with our consciousness, we manipulate those and see what happens. Whereas theologically, at least conceptually, the theological object, God, at least manipulated creation in order to create. So seems to be an opposite approach to the concept of who's manipulating whom.
So with mathematical objects, I think they enter into our experience in indirect ways, and I'm not quite sure that I would want to say that we manipulate them. I guess we can use them as tools within theories. It's up to us how we use them. But these mathematical objects do have a certain effect, a non-causal effect within our world. And I think you could say the same of the bare theological object. It could enter into experience in the same more diffuse way. And in terms that some people have objected to this kind of theory and said, well, wait a minute, isn't God supposed to be a creator? And how can as you put it, inert God create anything? So the counter argument to this would be, well, our understanding of causation comes from within the world. We have absolutely no idea what it would mean for a God to create a world. It's certainly not going to be involving physical causal chains, because the parameters which allow physical causal chains to begin are not present in the creation of a world. So I think this is a problem that can be overcome.
I like the idea that we have no idea. It's a problem that can be overcome. What we cannot overcome is the fact that we're out of time. So it's really great to see you. I love the conversation. It's terribly relevant for the Global Philosophy of Religion project in general, this conference in specific. And we, all of us at Closer to Truth, look forward to another engagement together. This is core concept for Closer to Truth.
Well, thank you very much. I really enjoyed our talk.